thank you so much for joining us for this Lunch and Learn. I've lost count of the number we've had now of these, but I think we're on our penultimate one. For FIRNS, anyone interested in FIRNS applications, and even those who are just sort of here to understand more about the growth of nature-related investments, nature-based investments, nature markets in Scotland and across the UK. I'm Helen Avery. I'm Director of Nature Programmes at the Green Finance Institute, and I'm joined by a wonderful group of experts today, and we're going to be diving into how to baseline ecosystem services, a really important part of the journey. It can be a costly part of the journey. We'll find out as we talk to those involved about what you can estimate for your cost, the things that you need to do, what it is exactly that buyers will be expecting of you, and perhaps ultimately other investors, and how you can get going on it. So I'm going to be joined today. First, we're going to hear from Patrick Jean-Martel at NatureScot, Environmental Green Finance Manager at NatureScot. He's just going to be going over that timeline with us again on the FIRNS applications. Then we'll be hearing from Pat Snowden. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Pat, Head of Economics and Woodland Carbon Code at Scottish Forestry. We'll be talking about the Woodland Carbon Code. We'll then be joined by Renee Kirkfleet-Hermans. Apologies, Renee, if I didn't pronounce your last name. I should have practiced beforehand. But many of you will know Renee as well. She's the peatland code coordinator at IUCN UK Peatland Programme. And then we'll be hearing from Penelope Whitehorn as co-chief scientist at Highlands Rewilding. And many of you may be familiar that Highlands Rewilding has done massive amounts of baselining across multiple ecosystem services. So it'll be really interesting to hear how they've been approaching it. So we do have a quick poll before I hand over to Patrick. And that's just, we're keen to know, of those of you who are joining us in the room today, are you applying for FIRNS funding? Yes, no, or undecided? As John shared last time, John Utley, that is from NatureScot, there were over 70 expressions of interest. So we're just keen to understand how many might be moving through to the application round, and indeed be new applications. So we'll just give it a minute for people to fill that in. Hopefully it won't take as long as that. Just a reminder that we're going to have a Q&A at the end of this session. So please do post your questions. You can post them in the Q&A function. I also keep an eye on chat. So please do post them as we go along. We'll make sure we get to them. And I think that's about it. We will be recording today's panel that will be available to you afterwards. All of the panels, all the webinars, if you have missed them, are recorded and on either the FIRNS site, so we'll be showing some of the links, or they can be found on GFI site as well, I believe. So with that, I think we'll close the poll. And excellent. So 14 no. Maybe we'll convince you in this one, or maybe you're just here to learn more about these from our wonderful experts. Yes, 17 and 5 undecided. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you for filling that in. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Ellen, and hi everyone, and thank you for showing up at this new FIRNS workshop on baselining and estimating ecosystem services. You must now all be familiar with what this facility for investment-ready nature in Scotland is about. So promote innovation and support the development of this rapidly growing natural capital market in Scotland, and to do so in line with the Scottish Government's principle for responsible investment, and in particular promoting a just transition. So when looking at bringing nature, community engagement, and private finance together, there is one universal truth, and it's that data is central and essential. The first natural step in any place-based project is to determine what opportunities are available in terms of restoration and community benefits, but also in terms of what would be valuable both from a private sector or investor's perspective and from also a public funding's perspective. And that's where a lot of the initial enabling work is concentrated. Having looked at the expression of interest so far, many of you are in that exact spot of the development journey. Once that baseline has been established on the specific habitats or areas you're focusing on, you need that data not only to assess opportunities on the land available, but also to measure and verify progress to pilot your project. The particularity with natural capital project is that you also need that data to materialize the additional benefits and ecosystem services that you're enabling through the works. Specific methodologies have been developed to that effect, like the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Code, that will help you in that regard by establishing a scientifically recognized process that's standardized and simplifying things a bit, and that will generate units of that data that can then be valued and offered to buyers, for example. We have some of the great minds behind these codes with us today, and that will they will talk about these more in detail a little bit further down the line. So these are for sequestration of carbon, and the current challenge is to develop a similar approach to biodiversity in Scotland. But yeah, that's proving to be quite challenging. If no codes are available for the ecosystem services you're looking at, then you will have to develop your own methodology or figure out a way to measure it and choose the right metrics, which is in a project by itself. But if it's done correctly, this is how natural capital markets could grow, and that's also what we're looking to support with FIRNS. As I often like to put it, when dealing with offset buyers or private investors or ESG impact investors, you are essentially selling them data. And this is a central part of the business model you are trying to build around the restoration of the natural assets you're looking at. But this data will only be meaningful if you have set a baseline and if you are reporting it in a form that is suitable or compatible with what the buyers or private stakeholders require. And that's something that has to be discussed with them as soon as possible. I will just point out that in the field baseline surveys are currently not in the FIRNS scope in terms of funding. We're targeting projects that have already done that step or that have already secured other means of funding for that bit. So this baselining doesn't only apply to environmental impact. To a certain extent, we could argue that this should also be considered for community benefits. But there again, there is no real framework, agreed framework or metrics that have been developed to kind of measure and assess progress on that part. So this has to be built from scratch accordingly to the context of the project. Going back to the FIRNS process and the timeline, you will have received feedback on your expression of interest by now, or you will receive them shortly, meaning today, tomorrow, the latest, and I apologize for the slight delay. And hopefully that feedback will give you some pointers for the full application. So that full application form is available on the website, and the window for submitting these will close on the 16th of June, midday. And the announcement of successful applications will be made through around mid-August. Also, it may be useful to know that to support you in the process of drafting these applications, we will set up a couple of clinic sessions, hopefully starting on the week of the 29th of May, and we will disclose more information on this shortly, so stay tuned. I think that's enough of me. I'll now pass it to Pat Snowden, who will be providing us with some details about the Woodland Carbon Code. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. And hello, everybody. I'm Pat Snowden. I work at Scottish Forestry. I'm just going to take 5 minutes just to say a little bit about the Woodland Carbon Code. So next slide, please. I'm sure you know this, but people often ask the question, what is it? It's a domestic, so it's UK only, voluntary carbon standard, and its sole purpose in many ways is to undermine market trust and confidence. That's what it's all about, so that if people purchase carbon credits using the code, they will have confidence that they'll get the credits they've paid for. And so it's a central thing to carbon markets at the moment, is to support integrity and build trust in them. You can see it's some years since we started working on it, originally in 2007, actually, in the Forestry Commission. And Since devolution in forestry in 2019, it's been run by Scottish Forestry on behalf of the UK, and we have a relatively small team in Scottish Forestry. We have an executive board, which is all the forestry authorities across the UK, which make all the decisions about the code. So it's run by government at the moment. And then we have an advisory board of stakeholders who play an important role. And it's endorsed internationally by ICROA, which is the International Carbon Watchdog. Next slide, please. Another question people often ask is, what do you need for a good quality code? Particularly with nature-based solutions, you want robust science. That is really critical, because people need to know from a technical perspective that they'll get the carbon they're paying for. Permanence is important, and nature-based solutions do get challenged about this. We have various mechanisms in place for it. Creating a woodland is a permanent change in land use under the Forestry and Land Management Act in Scotland. We also take conservative estimates, and we have buffers, which again are taken off the carbon estimates and are put to one side in case there are any losses from a woodland. The additionality rules are important. You need to show that the carbon market is actually making some material difference to meeting climate change targets. There's a lot to say about additionality, but little time now. It's independently validated and verified by the Soil Association and organic farmers and growers. It's not done by us, and they're accredited by UCAS, the government accreditation service, to do that. And then the final thing is transparency, and the carbon registry, which is run by S&P Global. They're based in New York. That registry records every single carbon credit. Each one has its own identifier, and you can see on the registry whether the credit's been used or not. And it's there to avoid problems of double counting, etc. Next slide, please. Quickly, this is roughly how a woodland grows. It starts off quite slowly, then it speeds up, and then it tails off. This will vary, of course, depending on the species. A couple of things to say about this slide. When you start off, you don't really have any carbon. You've validated your project, but nothing's yet happened. Now, you do have an estimate of the amount of carbon that the project will deliver, because the project will have used our carbon lookup tables to provide an estimate. And that gives you a number of what we call pending issuance units, which you can sell to a buyer, but they can't be used against anybody's carbon footprint. As the woodland grows and you start to verify that growth, then you start to transfer these pending issuance units into what we call woodland carbon units, which are verified units that companies can actually use against their footprint. And you can see there that how the prices have gone up. That's been the big story in the last few years. And I should probably update this slide, actually, because we hear of cases of 30, 40 pounds plus now. But if somebody is asking me for an average, we still stick closer to 20. Next slide, please. In terms of the process, the first thing you need to do is register on the carbon registry. And to do that, you need to come up with a carbon calculation. So you need to set a baseline for your project. There's details on our website about how to do this. And then once you've done that, you submit your project for validation. And to do that, you have to put together a project design document that sets out how you'll manage the woodland, what species you'll use, what soil type it's on, etc., what the wider benefits are. You also have to do your additionality calculations to show that you need carbon finance for the project to go ahead. Obviously, if you don't need carbon finance, it will fail under the code, because that project would have happened anyway. Once validated, then there are periodic verifications, which again, the Soil Association and organic farmers and growers adjudicate over. First one's at year 5, mainly a stocking density check and health check at that point. And then every 10 years after that, where they actually go out and measure on site the amount of carbon that's been delivered. Who's involved? Well, there's a project developer. It could be the landowner. It could be an agent working on their behalf. What we call intermediaries, they cover quite a lot of different organizations who act as a link between buyers and sellers and advise projects on how to set themselves up. Then there's obviously the validators, the verifiers. There's us as the regulator. We do checks on every project. And then there's the registry. So those are the sort of key players involved in this process. Next slide, please. In terms of the costs, it's free to register, but validation, it's around about £800. It varies a bit. You can group projects together, which will provide a cost saving, say of around 40% in many cases. At validation, there's a charge of 10 pence for every validated carbon credit. Half of that goes to the registry to cover the cost of operating the registry, and the other half comes to us to offset some of our costs. Verification at the moment can be in the region of £2,000 for a project. There's a site visit involved. It will be very interesting in future to see, with the advent of remote sensing and things, how those costs may be able to come down. And you can see there the sort of, depending on what carbon price you have, how much income you might generate over time. Next slide, please. One final thing to say then, these are the numbers of projects. In purple are the number actually in Scotland. The main thing to say is that we've had an exponential growth in the last 3 or 4 years in the number of projects coming in under the code. I think the net zero targets have a lot to do with that. Many businesses can see what's coming down the road, and now's a good time to plant woodlands. Most of the large projects tend to be in Scotland. So you'll find that while the number of projects is more evenly split across the UK, most of the sequestration is taking place in Scotland. I think that's the key point to make. And you can see there's a lot of projects in the pipeline, which is putting us under some pressure at the moment to process them. And that was all I was going to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. It's a great whiz through, and I really appreciate it. There's so much on the site. It really is, I mean, everything you need to know about how to apply and what the Woodland Carbon Code is. It's so comprehensive. So we'll put that link up in the chat if you're not familiar with it, but it's a really incredible site. Just so briefly, before we sort of then hear from Renee about the peatland code, more than half the projects are actually in Scotland, of all the Woodland Code projects, if my math was correct there. So I just wondered, are there any that you want to sort of highlight for those thinking of applying that are really interesting or innovative or a good exemplar of how you might work with the Woodland Carbon Code, particularly perhaps if people are thinking about whether they can stack it with other ecosystem services as well? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Helen. There's a series of case studies on the website. So if you look at the top bar of the website, you'll see them there. So they'll go into some detail and tell the story really behind some of these projects, because I think that's a key point. It's not just about the carbon. So you could go and look at the Craig and Gillen example, for example, in Ayrshire, which delivers on a number of counts. It's part of the UNESCO biosphere, Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere. It provides recreational access, educational facilities. It's important for landscape purposes. They're looking to generate some hardwood production at that site. And it's an important resource for the local community in a sort of post-industrial era in that area. So there's quite a lot of stories to say about that particular project. Another one that's attracted some attention is the Trees for Life project up in the north of Scotland. And interestingly, they've actually donated about 1/3 of their carbon revenues to the local community. So again, it's they are an exemplar in that sense of how you can redirect resource back into the local community. In terms of stacking and bundling, I mean, projects they can do this subject to our additionality rules. So it all depends whether it compromises the ability of carbon finance to show that it's needed for the project to be financially viable. So if you stack 2 or 3 different revenue streams together, that is potentially okay, but not if it means that you don't need the carbon finance for it to be viable. That's the crucial thing. This is a very live issue. It's been talked a lot about across the UK. And on the one hand, you want to ensure that land managers are being rewarded for these benefits that they're providing. But on the other hand, the code really is a rule taker. We have to follow the rules of the wider carbon market globally. So it's getting that balance right, really.
Yeah. And just for those, if this is the first webinar you're joining us on, Trees for Life did come and speak on the community engagement participation webinar. So you'll find a bit more detail on them. And we also have a few case studies on GFI Hive, but there's lots of information out there on what Trees for Life are doing, for example. But that's great to hear about the case studies, and we've got the link in the chat. Just finally, and I'm sure we'll come onto this in Q&A, but any sort of immediate tips or practical advice as projects are considering using the Wood and Carbon Code in their FIRNS applications and for their projects, what would you have them know?
Well, there's a whole process to actually planting trees. So, and very often the first step is to engage with one of our woodland officers in Scottish Forestry at a local level. So you want to get in touch with the local office, basically. And they can advise on a number of things, but there are tools to work out what species might be appropriate on site, what management opportunities would be appropriate. And again, the woodland officer can advise around that. So there's the forest management aspect is important. Again, agents, intermediaries can help with this as well, if you look on our website. There is a tool called the ESC, the Ecological Site Classification Tool, which can help in that regard. That's on there's a link to it on the Wood and Carbon Code website, but it's developed by Forest Research. In terms of the Wood and Carbon Code, you'd want to know what finance you're going to bring in, and you'd want to get an early indication of whether you think you'll be eligible in terms of additionality. And the other thing you'd want to look at is go onto our website, put in the species you're planning to plant, the soil type, etc., because we net off any soil emissions, it's important to say, depending on the soil type. And you'll get a feel then for how much carbon you'll get, well, you'll get an estimate over time, how much CO2 will be sequestered by the project. So that's really important information to have before you actually take it forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pat. Thank you. And I'm seeing questions start to be populate into the Q&A, so we'll come back to those in a moment. But Renee, over to you. I know you're going to give us a short, brief run through of the peatland carbon code, and then we've got a couple of questions for you.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, so some of my slides are actually quite similar to Pat's, so I'm just going to briefly skim over them. So the process of the peatland code and the woodland carbon code are actually very similar. So it's always great when we speak after each other because it helps speeding things up. So I just need to be able to remove that. Yes. So just as a very brief recap, the peatland code is similar to the woodland carbon code. It's a UK government-backed domestic voluntary carbon market standard that landowners with eligible damaged peat can follow to attract private finance for peatland restoration by selling carbon units. And the purpose, oh, I don't know what I did there. You're getting a preview in all my slides, sorry. The purpose of the peatland code is to provide assurance to buyers. So just very briefly on the background, so the peatland code was launched in 2015. Then we've had a few alterations, but in March this year, we've published version 2 of the peatland code. And I will do a very quick highlight of what we changed, but the main one was that we've got now FIRNS included. On the peatland code management, so we've got a small team now working daily on the peatland code, but we also have an executive board, a technical advisory board, and a market and investment forum behind us. So this is very similar to what Pat just showed you, so I'm not going to go over this, but just to highlight that on the peatland code, we follow the same principles of robust science, independence, additionality, and all of that are part of what we do as well. So version 2 of the peatland code, so just as a very brief overview of the headlines of the changes we've made. So first of all, we've changed our emission factors, so they're back in line with the UK greenhouse gas inventory. Since the science will always emerge and update, so these numbers will always be, like, we keep obviously track of those changes, and we will make sure that the peatland code stays aligned with the UK greenhouse gas inventory. There were some small technical changes to how we baseline bulks and how we which kind of categories are eligible. Small changes to additionality rules impact us very little. The big one was that FIRNS are now as well eligible, so it's not just about upland bogs anymore, but FIRNS are eligible. With that comes as an option wet agriculture, so having crops but partially raising your water table, and we're looking at polluticulture, but the call for evidence is actually not out yet, so that's coming soon, hopefully. Just as a quick overview, so we now have just under 170 projects registered, and as you can see on the map, most of them are in Scotland. And from that graph, you can see that we also are seeing an exponential growth, although we're not at the numbers of the Woodland Carbon Code yet, since we are quite a bit younger. So the way that the peatland code works is that we work with condition categories. And I've just put on this slide the eligible condition category. So we now have they're split into either bogs or fens. So for bogs, you've got actively eroding condition category, and that's split into hags and gullies or flat bare, drained, modified bog, cropland, grassland intensive, and grassland extensive. And for fens, you've got cropland, grassland intensive, extensive, and modified fen. And I'll just go over how we baseline for how projects need to baseline for either of these, because they've got different methodologies of baselining. So we've got, under the peatland code, we've got a field protocol that sets out exactly what every project needs to do to baseline, and also to then for ongoing verifications to recheck, obviously, that baseline, that they have made the difference that we expected up front. So initially, projects need to do a desk-based mapping exercise. So that can be using satellite image, but can also be using drone image at that point. You need to map non-peat features. You need to map your hags and gullies that are already visible on that satellite or drone image. Map your eroding flat bare areas, your artificial drains, and then you need to map your buffers around that. And the field protocol sets out exactly how you need to do that. And then you also need to map your eligible and ineligible modified condition category. Then it's obviously crucial that you check in the field that what you've done behind your desk, that's actually true in the field. You start off with measuring peat depth, initially on a 100 by 100 meter grid, but we've now increased that if you hit shallow peat, you need to increase that to a 50 by 50 meter grid. And down at the bottom right there, that's an example of how that then looks. But the field protocol goes into more detail for that. You obviously need to check that your desk-based condition categories are right. So that what you thought that you could see from a satellite or a drone image is really there in the field. That wasn't a shadow, and it was really actively eroding, for example. And you need to take baseline evidence. So that can be baseline, so it can be fixed point photographs, or it can be drone footage as well. And then this is one example of a map that comes out of that. So this is an active project by Angus Davidson Limited. And you can see they use the satellite image as the starting point, mapped their actively eroding hags and gullies, a flat bare, and then the drainage buffers around it. This is already field checked, so they know that that's all there. Then moving on to FIRNS, so it's slightly different, same field protocol. So it's the field protocol split up in bogs and FIRNS. You start off exactly the same. You start desk-based, mapping your non-peat features. Then you need to map your vegetation type, and that's split into that crop or grass or fen vegetation. And you also need to map your drains or irrigation channels. Then again, you need to go back out in the field to check that that's true. Also, you need to do your peat depth measurements. They're slightly different for crop and grassland, so they're done for modified. So in crop and grassland, you need to do it on a 100 by 100 meter grid. In modified, it's transect. And And if anybody wants to have more information on why, then please drop me a line and we can discuss that further. But I don't think you've got time for that today. The other big difference with bulks is that you need to do water table measurements. So you need to have one continuous logger in each representative field unit, 5 manual dip wells read monthly, and 50 rust rods that are read quarterly, or if you prefer, you can change them for 15 more dip wells. And that water table measurement is really crucial because that's used in the actual emission calculator for FIRNS. So that's slightly different from your bulks calculator. You also need to do a drain assessment, checking if your drains are draining or if they're actually irrigation channels. And then you need to check that your desk-based condition categories were correct, similar to bulks, and also take your baseline evidence. I don't have an example map of this one yet because FIRNS are really early days and we don't have a validated project that can show a map from just yet. So that will be coming hopefully soon. And then just as a last one, so there is obviously a lot of work on the way on new technologies for baselining and measuring all of these for your project. So drones are now down to a position of 2 centimeters in some instances, and they are really, a lot of our projects are using them for the baselining, but also to keep monitoring their site. So it's a really good tool to really show what you've done on site, how your baseline looked like, but also how successful your restoration is. Satellites are really, there's quite a lot of work going on there. For example, the bulk breathing that Terrestrial does. So hopefully when that's ready, we can get that as an MRV under the peatland code as well, and any other technologies that are being developed. LiDAR can potentially be used on your hags and gullies, for example, to measure how high and deep they are, but that's still on the way. And I'm sure there's lots more coming. So the way that the peatland code deals with that is that those kind of methodologies can be applied under the peatland code, so they go through the technical advisory board and executive board to make that decision if they're good enough or not, and then they can be adopted under the peatland code. And that's all I was going to mention here.
Thank you, Renee, and that's really great. And again, I appreciate that we're asking you to fly through these, but there is again so much detail on the site, and I know that among you all here, it's not the first webinar you've done, so I'm sure there are many recordings going into a lot of detail about how you can walking you through the use of these codes. Just quickly before we move on to Penelope, and then I'm hoping to leave a good set of time for questions because I can see some coming in. One is, everyone sort of says, well, where can I find case studies? So I think just as a quick one, is there a place that people can go to find some of those?
So we do. It's one of our big lists to do some more in-depth case studies. There is some information available, but not really in-depth. So some of our project developers do have on their websites already. So for example, Forest Carbon have some worked out examples. Caledonian Climate, and I'm sure others have as well. But we need to pull them into our website. So hopefully we're going to do a whole overhaul of our own website soon. So there will be more soon on our website.
Great, thank you. Sorry to ask you that one up front. And I don't know if we have a couple on the investment readiness toolkit. I know there is a Welsh peatland project, but I don't know if we'll put the link up to that. I just wondered what sort of time frame should people give themselves if they're thinking about using the peatland code? Because I know, like everything needs to sort of taken off like rockets, but there's only so much capacity for the delivery of the verification and things like that. So yeah, what's sort of your advice to those looking to use the code?
So doing all your, are you asking from the moment of you getting all your documents into the validator, or all that work up front? Because
I think that work up front.
Yeah. So that is quite a couple of months, because you need to do that baselining, but then you need to fill in the emissions calculator. You need to do your consultation. So that's part of your project as well. So and there's guidance in the peatland code on how to do that. Project design documents, but then you also need to fill in your additionality calculator. So for that, you need to have your quotes from your contractors, ideally. If you're blending it with public finance, you need to have your public finance funding offer in. So yeah, there is quite a lot of documents that you need to fill in. So I would leave a couple of months for that. Then the actual, when you've got all your documents ready, you then hand that into the validator for your project design validation. You can already start your restoration at that point if you want to. There's obviously some risk to your project if you do that. But that validation, that initial project validation, will take ideally about 2 to 3 months. We have recently increased capacity in our validation bodies. So we now have 3 validation bodies: Organic Farmers and Growers, Soil Association, and SAC Consulting. So that should now hopefully really be 2 to 3 months. Previously, there was a bit of a backlog there, but that should be resolved. However, that 2 to 3 months depends on how responsive a project is to the questions from the validator. That's a really, really crucial part in there.
That's really helpful advice. Thank you, Renee. Brilliant. Just for case, because conscious of time, I'm going to move on to come to you now, Penelope. But I will point Renee and Pat to some questions that are in the Q&A. There's one from Pete Ritchie for you, for example, Renee. Then if you type them in, I can reread them afterwards for anyone who's watching this on a recording, just to make sure we can get to everyone. But with that, over to you, Penelope.
Thanks very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see that fine. So thanks very much for asking me to speak today. I work as co-chief scientist for Highland Tree Wilding, where we manage land across 3 states for nature recovery as well as community benefits. And I'm going to talk today about the baselining work we've been doing for biodiversity at one of our estates, Beldorney in Aberdeenshire. I'm focusing on this estate as this is where the work has been carried out most recently, last year, predominantly over the summer months. So this is a 350 hectare estate. It's mainly grassland with some patches of coniferous plantation and a little bit of native broadleaf. And so in the absence of any officially accepted biodiversity metric or credit system, we've aimed to as comprehensively survey our biodiversity as possible. So we're ready in place for when a system is developed, and also so that we can really accurately get a good picture of the biodiversity that we have in this sort of starting condition of our estate, so we can accurately track any changes over time and properly quantify them. So to get a really good picture of biodiversity, we've focused on 6 metrics, and I'll talk through the methods for each really briefly in turn. So these are habitats, plants, terrestrial invertebrates, soil, aquatic invertebrates, and also breeding birds. To start off with the habitats, we worked with Plant Life for this, and they had ecologists out to the estate to carry out a full vegetation survey to classify the land according to the NVC's, the National Vegetation Classification, which gave us a really great detailed picture. And we've been complementing that with a lot of desk study to see how this classification translates into UNIS and also UK HABs and the DEFRA metric, and also can satellite imagery be used as well to help with this classification. And we found that the satellite imagery analysis is not quite there yet, in that it misclassified quite a lot of habitats and missed some off altogether. So at this stage, we really need on-the-ground ecologists to carry out that work and to crucially give a condition of each habitat, which is really important when baselining. And onto the plant diversity, we also worked with Plant Life for this, and we had quadrats across the estate, so at the nodes of a 200-metre grid. And within each quadrat, surveyed for the plant species present. So we have a species list for each quadrat, and also some structural data was gathered. So things like the sward height and the percentage of bare ground, which again is good at giving an idea of condition of some habitats like woodlands and grasslands, and some idea of the structural diversity there. And so on to terrestrial invertebrates. So we use malaise traps and pitfall traps. So malaise traps are for catching flying insects, basically. They're a big sort of tent thing that funnels insects into a pot. And each of these, we had 15 of those, each was supported by 3 pitfall traps, which is basically a cup sunk into the ground to catch ground-dwelling invertebrates like beetles. And these were in place for 2 weeks last summer. And once all the insects were collected, they were sent off to Natrimetrics, who did the analysis in the lab with DNA metabarcoding to find out all the species that were present. So to give a full taxa, a species list of what is present in each site. And unfortunately, yet this cannot give a measure of abundance of each species found. So you just get a species richness measure. And that just a very brief graphic to give you an idea of the sort of numbers we were getting out. So huge numbers of invertebrates, different species found, and a good idea of how this varies across the estates. But this is just species number. For soil diversity, again, we worked with Natrimetrics. So we took 45 soil samples in total. And these were sent to Natrimetrics, who looked at the eDNA for soil invertebrates and fungi. So again, a great picture of how the diversity varies across the different habitats on the estate, but this is just a species richness measure. So to try and look at abundance as well in-house, we basically took soil samples and sorted them by hand to count the number of worms and grubs that were in this soil, and counted them and weighed them. But again, that's not directly comparable with those eDNA samples, but it's a separate measure to look at soil fauna biomass. And the aquatic diversity, this was another eDNA measure analysed by Natrimetrics. We had 15 samples across the site, which looked at soil vertebrates and also the freshwater invertebrates. And some of the species obviously are really good indicators of soil water quality. And finally, the breeding bird surveys, we did these in-house, so ecologists on the team walked transects across the estates last year following the BTO standard methodology to count the number of birds and the different species found on our site. And so those are our 6 main metrics. And to complement these, we've got camera traps out to survey the large and medium mammals. And this probably won't feed into a metric as such, but it really helps with the management of the site for things like deer. We've also been using audio moths to do some acoustic analysis, and we're doing some really interesting comparisons at the moment to how the data collected from these compares with the sort of in-house surveys done on the ground by ecologists, and how the data collected of birds, for example, compares with the transect surveys. So that's definitely an up-and-coming method, but I think there's a lot more work needs to be done to really accurately get good measures for species abundance and richness. And finally, we've just been doing some moth trapping and reptile surveys just to get a really full picture of all the species diversity that we have on the site. So for timelines, this was all carried out, the actual field surveys were carried out, as I said, last summer, but we're still actually analysing some of the data now, we're nearly into the next summer. So there's an awful lot of information we get out of this, and a lot of work ongoing at the moment on how all this information can be sort of consolidated down into a number for biodiversity, and how this can be used in a metric. And we're trying to be as open as possible with our data and share it widely to hopefully we're really in that in the process of development of different biodiversity metrics. So that was a really quick whiz through, and happy to answer any questions on those different techniques.
Thanks, Penelope. It's such a broad amount of work. Before we start taking questions, I wonder if you can just share with us then how do you kind of make a business case for gathering all this information when markets are still forming? Are you considering it in a sort of a biodiversity plus for the sale of woodland carbon, and I know that you've got peatland work as well across highlands rewilding, and are you waiting for biodiversity credits? We'd just love to hear what is the reason to do this as a business case, I suppose.
Yeah, so I guess this is in preparation for the biodiversity credit market, which is definitely coming at some point in the next months, year. So hopefully we'll be in a really good position to be ready for that when it does emerge. And also we're hoping to offer as a company a sort of platform service and give advice to other landowners. And so we've collected a broader range of data using different techniques as possible. So basically we've taken on the risk of this and made the mistakes, and so we can really in a good position to give advice to other landowners on the sort of optimal methods to use to accurately measure their biodiversity.
And just are you also looking at sort of the more traditional, it seems almost weird to say traditional, but the traditional codes as well at the moment?
Yes, we are. Yeah, we have areas for the woodland carbon code, and again, yeah, as Renee was saying, the peatland, that's more on Bunloit, other estate as our areas of peatland there. But there's actually a small patch of peatland on Beldorney we've just been discussing that might actually be eligible for peatland as well.
And you've obviously worked with a lot of partners. You mentioned some there, Nature Metrics, Plant Life. What advice might you give to other project developers about how do you determine who's best to work with?
Yeah, there's definitely an awful lot of companies out there, and they're all promising an awful lot. So I guess just to be really clear from the outset that you're really keen to get the data as well, the sort of underlying data, because I know some companies are very good at producing a sort of a very nice report, but it's really important to be able to have access to the underlying data for that as well, to make your case really strong for that. And yeah, just to be really clear from the outset of what you're actually hoping to achieve through the project. And yeah, there's definitely some fantastic companies out there, and I can mention also Carbon Rewild is really good for acoustic monitoring, but there are many developing, and again, you know, we're happy to offer advice on that as well if anyone wants to approach us for, you know, wondering who to use, because there's a lot of people out there.
That's fantastic. I'm seeing a question from Karen Blackport, for example, in the chat about are there alternatives to Nature Metrics when it comes to eDNA? And then Lindsay McKinley has asked, don't know if you disclose this, but can you give a guide to how much it sort of costs to baseline all that ecological data?
Yeah, basically it's a lot. I think for the methods that I talked through, the most costly things there were Nature Metrics, and then using Plant Life as consultants, ecologists. I think as a broad, for our 350 hectare estate, for a very approximate cost, we could say 65,000 to baseline that in as much detail as we have done.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Great, we've got 10 minutes and we've got quite a lot of questions. I appreciate that Pat and Renee have answered some already, but let's just pick a couple of these. So one from Adrian, I think is piggybacking off Johnny's question earlier. Does anyone here know about standards and measurement protocols for biochar? Has anyone seen those? I do not know them myself, but actually if anyone has, beyond our panel, please type it in the chat. No, sorry Adrian, we can't help you on that one. David Tollick says it is important to consider if species-rich grassland is being planted with trees. How can this be avoided? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, David. Does anyone else?
Well, I guess just that shows the importance of getting a full habitat survey done before any management changes are implemented. So, I mean, if you discover that there's a really nice species-rich grassland, which has benefits of its own, perhaps you could get more carbon through it by planting trees, but it has biodiversity benefits as itself. So yeah, just that's shows the importance of accurately baselining.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat, Tess Fitzgerald, are there ways of stacking additional benefits such as health, social, education along with existing credits? Pat, I think you mentioned one in that case study. I don't know if they were able in that case to sell those specific more social benefits.
No, they're not sold as such, but if a project delivers wider benefits, there is evidence that you'll get a higher carbon price, because quite a lot of buyers don't just want the carbon, they want to show they're doing the right thing by local communities. You'll have seen some of the criticisms about impacts on local communities in some cases. And the same for biodiversity. You know, I mean, it's a good question about grasslands. There is guidance, by the way, in the UK Forestry Standard about grasslands and open habitats within woodland planting. So we bundle all these things into the credit at the moment rather than stack them. But we'll see how that goes over time.
Thank you. Penelope, what about on anything beyond the ecological huge amount of baselining that you've done on either Bunlight or Beldorney?
Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't phrase it pretty well. It was wondered if you had, beyond the ecological baselining, whether you'd looked at any sort of the social or health benefits, whether that was on your radar yet. Appreciate you're sort of early along.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, we've also done, as alongside biodiversity, and we're also doing carbon baselining as well, and also social. We're doing a lot of social survey type work at the moment, and are really establishing a sort of roadmap for engaging with local communities and how best to do this, and sort of establish a real proper baseline for that as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And just to show everyone, there's so much going on here, but Hannah Rudman has put a really great link in the chat as well of an amazing case study that looks at decision grade data. So definitely worth having a look at that. Right, let me see what we've got here. One question I did want to ask everyone was, is there a specific time of year that is best to do your baselining, whether it's woodland, peatland, or all the other amazing things that you can baseline on your land? Because I feel like that was something that we found early on when building the toolkit. People hadn't factored that in, and that put them back a bit. So Renee, I see you've come off mute. What's your advice?
Yeah, that's a good point when you indeed schedule everything. So for peatlands, like you need to avoid, in most cases, birth breeding season. So most peatland work is actually done over winter, which sounds slightly bonkers because that's the wettest, most difficult time to be out there. So that should be factored into your project as well. The risk, if you're high up on a mountain, then you probably will not be able to have that whole restoration season because you might be snowed off. But you have to avoid birth breeding season because they ground nest in peatlands, so you don't want to step on them or interfere with them.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Renee. Pat?
I mean, yeah, the simplest thing in woodlands is the planting season generally runs from, say, October time through to April, May. It could be even to June in some bits of Scotland, but so you wouldn't want to plant outside that time because it's not a good time to establish young seedlings. So that's when the work takes place.
Thank you. And Penelope, on baselining, is it, I guess?
Yeah, I think it depends exactly on what species you're looking at, but for invertebrates, summer months obviously always the best, spring, early summer for birds, and soil, I think autumn is the best time.
Fantastic. Thank you. Patrick, I don't know if this is one for you, from Sean Robertson in the chat, just asking, and actually I imagine many people on the panel will know this as well. Is work underway to develop a biodiversity metric for Scotland? My understanding is that some companies have adapted the DEFRA BNG approach and using that. But Patrick, were you able to sort of update us on the status?
Yes, so there is currently several strands of work looking at this. So there is a consultation from the Scottish government to look at the metrics based on the DEFRA, the DEFRA metric and the BNG scheme that was developed south of the border. There are then several independent, I should say, initiatives that are trying to develop their own code or market around credits, biodiversity credits. So there is one Nature Scott sponsored with the Scottish government. That's the CIFTech Challenge one that was won by Credit Nature. So we're currently supporting them in trying to develop their vision of how the market would pan out. So through tokens, as they call it. But then there are several projects that have applied for the FIRNS, for example, that are trying to develop their own approach because of the specificities of their site, or they have their own idea of how it could be shaped. So there isn't really a clear direction for it. So it's going to be a watch and see, and look at the ones that will be selected naturally by the market, or that seems the more interesting from an investor perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Well, we've got only about a couple of minutes left. So I think what I'm going to do is, I see there are some quite technical questions for you, Penelope, just sort of asking about specific baselining that you've done. We're going to take those and we'll put them to Penelope after, so she can fill those in. And then there are a couple of others that I think we can probably tackle offline. Those that have been answered in the chat by Renee and Patrick and Pat, we'll put those on a sort of questions that will accompany the recording of this particular webinar. So if you are listening as a recording, you'll have a document that you can see the answers to the questions that we weren't able to verbalize just due to time. And again, maybe some of you watching haven't had a chance to look through the answer Q&A, but we'll put all that down for you, and also capture everything that's in the chat and then links. So quite a lot, obviously, this is a really important topic. I think that's evident by the number of people who wanted to attend this webinar, and also just the amount of engagement. So maybe something also worth following up with, following up on down the line as well in a bit more detail. But we will try and point you to the multiple resources that are already out there. As I say, Renee and Pat have done goodness knows how many webinars on the codes that we can maybe track down those links and share with you if you want to watch something in a bit more detail. And I know that we are planning on getting up more detail about Highlands rewilding and some of the amazing baselining they've done. And Hannah's obviously shared some work as the case study in the chat. So I'm going to leave it there. We have our final webinar that will be about working with buyers, and where we'll have people sort of talk about how they're identifying buyers, how they're working with buyers, and hopefully even have a buyer come on. That is on the 23rd of May. There's a registration link. There might be a change in time on that, but just to keep you posted. And then, as Patrick mentioned, there's a couple of clinic sessions which are going to be, you can come in, we'll go into breakout sessions, you can ask direct questions specifically about your application process to Nature Scott team. So they will be putting the dates of those up on the FIRNS website in a couple of weeks. So with that, just to say really big thanks to Penelope, Renee and Pat for coming on to share with us today. I know that it's just so helpful to the whole FIRNS process, and we're very grateful at GFI to be supporting Nature Scott and Scottish Government and National Lottery on the FIRNS process. So thank you very much, and thank you all for your amazing questions. We will not leave any unanswered, and you'll find the recording up very soon. Thank you.